Hi, welcome. Thank you for joining us today for our discussion around the U.S. rejoining UNESCO and the future of women and girls education. I am Danielle Dean. I am the co-chair of the Advocacy Committee here at UNA-NCA, which is the United Nations Association of the National Capital Area. UNA-NCA's mission is, is to connect the global to the local. That means everything from educating our members about, increasing public understanding of what the United Nations is, trying to influence our political, our policymakers by encouraging constructive U.S. leadership and strengthening our role at the United Nations, and then engaging our members. So preparing the future leaders to work in this world and to be global activists and policymakers. We are the largest and most active chapter of the United Nations Association of the United States of America, and we serve over 1,000 members in the DC, Maryland, and Northern Virginia area. I will be including a link for our chapter, and hope that everyone here and those watching in the future would take advantage of joining us in the work that we do. So for UNCSW, this year's theme is accelerating the achievement of gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls by addressing poverty and strengthening institutions and financing with a gender perspective. Today, we are going to be talking about the recent rejoining of the United States into UNESCO and what that means not only for U.S. Leadership and our engagement within UNESCO, but how we see the future of girls' education and how we can strengthen that institution specifically to address women and girls' education. This is specifically to address SDGs 4 on quality education and SDG 5 on gender equality. So thank you again for everyone for joining us, and I'm going to kick it off right to Audrey to lead our discussion.
Thank you, Danielle, and thank you. We welcome everyone who's able to join with us on this timely discussion, this parallel event for the 68th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, which is currently going on right now between March 11 and the 22nd. So we really are happy to be able to have our panelists here today. I would just like to briefly introduce them. Dr. James Williams. Dr. James Williams is a professor and director of the International Education and International Affairs at George Washington University, as well as UNESCO chair in the National Education for Development and the UNA-NCA Advisory Council member. Dr. Williams goes by Jim. He teaches graduate classes on education and development, education policy in developing countries, education of marginalized communities, education in emergencies, as well as international and comparative education. Then we have Ms. London Bell. Thank you so much for being with us. Ms. Bell is founder and president of Bell Global Justice Institute, a non-governmental organization in special consultative status, ECOSOC, which is the United Nations Economic and Social Council, focused on promoting gender equity and advancing and protecting the human rights of women and girls. Ms. Bell is a lawyer. She's a community organizer, an activist, and a humanitarian with specific educational training in international human rights law and policy and international business and trade law. Ms. London is also the 2020 African Descent Fellow for United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as a founding member and the current president of the Global Black Collective Institute. So it is a pleasure to have both of you join us here today for this timely discussion. I would like to be able to give you a few moments to tell us a little bit about your background, what you do, and then we'll go into some specifics.
Jim, would you like to start us off?
Why don't you go ahead?
Okay. Oh, thank you, Audrey. That wonderful introduction. I'm very happy to be here. I am very passionate about international law, international human rights system, and I'm most passionate about bringing local communities and helping local communities here, particularly in the Detroit area, understand how the UN works and how to use the international system to advance local issues here at home and then also abroad. So that's part of my work.
Oh, thank you. Very
Fantastic.
interesting.
Thank you.
I am a UNESCO chair, and I want to say quickly that I'm not, do not work for UNESCO, I'm not part of UNESCO, and don't speak for it. But I do know a fair bit about it. I think I'm passionate most about education, partly because, of course, I specialize that, but partly because of the sort of central role that education plays in so many aspects of development, at the individual, community, and collective levels. And so I think education is really important, and girls' education is really at the, not just girls, but it's often girls who lose out in education, and is really at the heart of the sort of true realization of the capacities or capabilities of human beings and societies. I do see education as a positive thing in many cases, but I also see that it's not necessarily always positive. Education can be used to exclude as well as to include. And so I think we have to be mindful of the way in which, and education plays out differently in gendered kind of ways. And so I think we have to be thoughtful about our ideas rather than assume that everything education is always good. So anyway, that's a little bit of my, not cynicism, but something like that. Realism, perhaps.
Thank you. Thank you both for that introduction. I think my first question, William, this is going to be a little twofold. So I'm going to combine these questions. And, given that UNESCO and the US has had a couple breakups, for lack of a better word, over the history of its relation, from the founding from 1945 until now. Can you give our listeners some background on what UNESCO is, how they foster the growth of girls' education, and a little bit of history, like why the US pulled out of UNESCO, and currently, how is Congress using that appropriations bill to if we have financial support to re-enter?
Sure. I'll do my best, and I feel free to cut me off. We talk professionally, so we can get carried away. Please also, any members who are listening and have more accurate information than I present, I welcome input, always learning. So UNESCO is, part of the UN, of course. It was founded near the end of World War II. Even during World War II, there was groups of educators and policymakers meeting to try to form some kind of entity that would work in education and other related areas to bring nations together. The US had a really important role in founding it, certainly instrumental role, really not the only one, but US played a big role in the founding of it. The famous beginning of the preamble by Archibald MacLeish says, "Since wars begin in the minds of men and women, it is in the minds of men and women that the defenses of peace must be constructed." And I think that very much captures the initial kind of the guiding spirit of UNESCO, which is to work it uses education, but also science, culture, communication, information to foster mutual understanding, respect for the planet. It sees the ordinary economic political arrangements of governments as certainly important, but not sufficient really to bring about peace, which needs to be built within and among people. And so UNESCO works to do that. Historically, the U.S. has played a kind of a funny role. On the one hand, historically, it's provided 22% of the budget for UNESCO. And at the same time, the U.S. has both supported UNESCO and stopped paying dues and withdrawn and then rejoined and such. And there's a bit of ambiguity about not ambiguity, ambivalence perhaps, about the U.S. And UNESCO. And I would argue, this is opinion, that one reason is, of course, the U.S. has its own interests, but I would also argue that UNESCO is something of a democracy. And in a democracy, not everybody gets all of what they want. But I'm not sure that's really appropriate to say. So yeah, peace must be founded upon dialogue and mutual understanding, built upon intellectual and moral solidarity of humanity. This was reaffirmed recently in the, it's reaffirmed in the SDGs Sustainable Development Goals Target 4.7, which says, by 2030, ensure all learners acquire knowledge and skills needed to promote sustainable development, including, among others, through education for sustainable development and sustainable lifestyles, human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and nonviolence, global citizenship, and appreciation of cultural diversity and of culture's contribution to sustainable development. UNESCO, and very high-minded, very abstract goals and or aspirations, I suppose. One of the problems of a democracy with high aspirations is they tend to use too many words because everybody gets their points in. Nonetheless, the spirit of the thing is that's very much the spirit of UNESCO in terms of education's role, and education is central to UNESCO's work, and we feel to development in general. This was all reaffirmed last year with the revision of the 1974 recommendation on education for peace and human rights, international understanding, cooperation, fundamental freedoms, global citizenship, and sustainable development. Again, too many words, but they're all good words. So let's see, the United States joined UNESCO at the beginning, helped create it, withdrew in 1984 because under Ronald Reagan, which in some sense saw the agency as mismanaged and corrupt, used to advance, possibly even to advance Soviet interests. Yes, those were the reasons given. In 2003, the U.S. rejoined UNESCO during the George W. Bush administration. Originally stopped funding UNESCO because of the, what is it here I'm looking for? The Title IV of Public Law 101-246, which says no funds shall be available for the United Nations or any specialized agency thereof, which accords the Palestine Liberation Organization the same standing as a member. And then this was broadened in 1994 to include any organization which is not recognized as a state. So that's the that law was automatic. It was triggered. It did not have to be. And so in October 2011, UNESCO voted to extend membership to Palestine, and this cut off U.S. funding to the agency. In 2013, after 2 years of not paying dues, the U.S. lost its vote. And then in 2017, under President Trump, the U.S. withdrew from UNESCO. Concerns about anti-Israel bias, poor management, financial difficulties, and values different from the U.S., or at least some of the U.S., official U.S. And then recently, there have been moves. The Biden administration from the beginning sought to rejoin UNESCO. And in December 2022, UNESCO said the U.S. could. In 2023, June, I think, the U.S. announced that it would rejoin UNESCO. And as of now, there are efforts in the omnibus funding bill, I believe, to begin repaying some of the dues. I don't know, that's probably way too much information, but I can follow up on any pieces you want.
Well, no, that's helpful. I mean, I think most Americans sometimes are surprised because out of all the UN agencies, it's one of the agencies that most Americans are familiar with, and so often surprised when they find out that America, the United States, was not a member for a very long time, and so this kind of tumultuous relationship leads to ask the question now, now that we are back in and we have dues to pay, and we've kind of opened up the table, left the vacuum for some from Chinese interests. Where now would you say, currently, how is Congress using that appropriations bill to allow for financial support to the agency? What can we kind of look to now that Congress has provided that kind of financial support?
Well, provided it's not yet law. And so I think that it's sort of in process, like many things in Congress right now. My understanding is, it's not finalized. I imagine without any evidence whatsoever that there will be funding, but there may be a battle over it because there are different views of UNESCO in the US. So there's right now a predominantly pro-UNESCO view at the official level. The popular level, much of it has always been positive in terms of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites and that sort of thing. But there's also groups that are not in favor. So a little hard to stay posted, right?
So I just wanted to add here that UNA NCA advocates for the full funding of the UN and its agencies and its meaningful way of promoting human rights, both peace and security, democracy, as a means to further goals towards the SDGs. So there's clearly like a noticeable connection between that appropriations process, Biden administration announcing the US rejoining UNESCO, and the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So, London, I'm going to ask this of you. Considered, the relationship between civil society and promoting US interests. How can we, as advocates, protect the work of UNESCO, given the current political climate?
Yes, thank you, Audrey. Thank you for the question. And Jim, thank you for a beautiful overview and history of UNESCO. I think part of what we can do as advocates is have these types of discussions where more and more people are understanding the history of UNESCO and the US relationship with UNESCO. And education is key. And I think part of our work as advocates is to ensure that local communities understand the important work of UNESCO. And so that means for us getting into our local churches and schools, community centers, businesses, and even through local government agencies, raising awareness about the work of UNESCO and the US engagement with UNESCO. I think building that education among fellow members of civil society so that we can include more people as advocates to our law and policy makers is key because there's power in numbers. And it's also important that not only are we educating the community about UNESCO, but that the community is also incorporating the different types of programming of UNESCO at the local level within school systems and different community-based organizations and centers, and also that we're using the power of media to amplify the work of UNESCO. So that's with all types of media, including social media. So I think working from the local perspective and gaining that support within fellow local communities is key to do.
Thank you, London. So, the priority here for the Commission on the Status of Women is, advancing the work for education for girls. And so I just wanted to get back to this, now that we're back into UNESCO and we're trying to we're supporting programs that have seen a lot of cutting and funding. Now that we're back in, how do you foresee UNESCO, fostering that growth of girls' education? Both Jim or London, either of you.
Okay, may I digress just a bit?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Just thinking about London's excellent points about what advocates can do, or the rationale for the U.S. membership in UNESCO. I was thinking beforehand as I was preparing of some reasons, and so just to kind of throw out some of these ideas, the benefits. I think one way to do it is to stress the benefits of being a member of UNESCO, an active member, a responsible dues-paying member of UNESCO.
Yes.
And another way is to, in a sense, bring it home by relating UNESCO to people's everyday lives. In terms of the benefits, if we're not a member, we don't have a voice. And we don't have a voice in one of the leading, it may not seem so in the US, but one of the leading microphones, in a sense, platforms in the world. And if we want to portray our values, we have to be a member sitting at the table in order to do so. Almost everything UNESCO does is good stuff. Most people would agree. And these are things we want to support, including girls' education, including the work in Africa, which are both priorities right now. It allows us another way to develop connections with other countries about issues that are not necessarily directly related to our politics. So it's another kind of soft diplomacy way of connecting and working with other nations on important issues affecting science, culture, education, and such. It helps us deal with problems that no single country can solve. And there are increasingly a lot of problems that are global in by nature, and it's difficult for one country to solve them. And UNESCO is another means, like other parts of the UN, to work on those issues. UNESCO has a particular interest right now in sustainability, and that it can pull different countries together. It is part of being a good world citizen, and I think that's an important value, to be a member, to be a good citizen for the world. Focused on our own interests, but to understand that our own interests are intertwined with the interests of the rest of the world, and to see, to engage in dialogue about those issues. And again, UNESCO is a good forum for that. The ideals of the founding, yes, building peace in the minds of people, and building peace with connecting with other people. World Heritage Sites, of course, dollars and cents that come to local communities from World Heritage Sites and such. And topics such as Holocaust education is a major focus of UNESCO. The other way to bring it to advocate is to emphasize the threats, and to think about UNESCO as a way to help mitigate, manage threats from outside. That's okay. I'm more interested in the benefits and the local. Anyway, I got lost in answering your question. Could you repeat it? I'm sorry. I got so important what I wanted to say.
So, well, my question is, we're focusing on the, the education of girls, and now that UNESCO has been refunded, what are some, I guess, practical logistic means now? Because there have been a number of programs that have been cut, with the US not at the table for so long.
Mm-hmm.
So, how are you? I guess maybe I can ask the questions. Now that we have UNESCO is US is back into trying to promote some of those programs, particularly for girls, education for girls and for women. How do you see UNESCO making that part more robust now that
Sure.
they have the funding?
Well, I'm not sure they have the funding yet. We're on the way to funding. But US is Rejoin for sure. I could be wrong about that, but my impression is that their funding hasn't quite come through yet. Well, one way is UNESCO is basically not a program. It's not a funding agency. It does have projects and it does work in most countries of the world, but it's not a project kind of funding sort of thing. And so what it does is through its the headquarters and then through regional and country offices, a number of programs. UNESCO tends to articulate visions, to gather people together to discuss and hammer out agreements and positions, to develop guidelines, standards that are agreeable across member countries, to help promote different activities, to just promote them through its gathering, its publications, and its platform. Some of the emphases right now are trying to attack gender equality is a major focus for UNESCO's work. Education, of course, in general, but gender equality through and in reduce inequalities in education and through education. And so education is seen as both a right in itself, but also a means toward greater equality. There's a focus now on empowering women in science and technology, particularly for environmental action, and a lot of work on women in STEM. There's effort to combat gender-based violence, inclusion more broadly, but particularly gender-based violence, often in the context of conflict-affected areas. There are attempts to bridge the digital gender divide, and to support women's empowerment in crisis, emergency, early recovery. So those are the main program areas that different countries country offices, regional offices and headquarters are working on. Gender equality is, it's a human rights issue. It's a precondition for sustainable people-centered development, and it's the core of UNESCO's ideas about how to build lasting peace. Happy to elaborate.
Thank you, Jim. No, thank you so much. I'm going to point this question to London. London, you were a fellow, excuse me, you were a fellow for the UN Office of Human Rights Program for People of African Descent as part of the International Decade for People of African Descent. And that fellowship, I understand, is an opportunity to identify leaders who are engaged in promoting the rights of diaspora communities, which is a very unique experience to have. Can you talk about how UNESCO works with OHCHR to advance the International Decade for the People of African Descent?
Yes. Thank you, Audrey. And so just a little bit of background on the International Decade for People of African Descent. It was established by the UN General Assembly through Resolution 68/237 in December of 2014. And so the years covered is from 2015 to 2024. So it is, and this is year 2024. There is talk about advocating for a second decade. So for right now, the International Decade for People of African Descent, it's a framework designed to encourage member states to work to end the injustices against people of African descent, and to strengthen the actions and measures to ensure the full realization of the economic, social, cultural, civil, and political rights of people of African descent and our full participation in society. And so the lead agency, of course, is the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. The theme for the decade is recognition, justice, and development. And so those are the three pillars. And so UNESCO works in close consultation with the High Commissioner's Office to help promote the decade, a better understanding and recognition of our culture and history and heritage through research, of course, and education, media, and inclusion and curricula, and ensuring that the historical facts of the slave trade, slavery and colonialism are out there, and giving people access to that information, and working with the High Commissioner's Office to fight discrimination against people of African descent by providing access to education. There are a couple of different programs that UNESCO has that is helping to amplify the unique experiences of people of African descent. One project is the Roots of Enslaved Peoples that was established in 1994, and it's sort of bringing to the forefront, breaking that silence around the history of slavery, and then the general history of Africa, which is a very comprehensive history of the African continent. And then I read a little bit about the International Coalition of Cities Against Racism, and that was launched in 2004. And that assists local authorities in combating discrimination in their capacity as policymakers and service providers in areas as education, employment, housing provision, and cultural activities. So that is, those are some of the ways that UNESCO is working to amplify the rights of people of African descent, and you know, in partnership with the Office of the High Commissioner.
Thank you, London. Thank you. That's fantastic to hear, that there are so many avenues on which UNESCO is still working, and it's encouraging to know that that work will continue to be supported. You know, going forward, you know, now that we're hopefully, as Jim keeps saying, you know, the money is earmarked, but we don't have it yet. So we're still waiting for Congress to do their part. And so, you know, given that, then, and going forward, can you discuss the challenges that you have seen in global policy when advancing girls' education, especially with regards to the programs in African countries or the African diaspora?
Want me to kick us off, or Jim, would you like
Oh,
to?
yeah.
Okay, so some of the challenges that I see, or what I would like to see more of, is that we are talking about girls' education, particularly girls of African descent, talking about education through an intersectional perspective. There are reasons why girls don't have access to education, don't have access to a quality education, that I would like for us to talk more about. Like, for example, ensuring that girls who are living with disability and who are living with chronic illnesses have access to education. Our schools and communities in developing and developed countries, are they empowered with policies and resources to ensure girls living with disability and chronic illness are attending schools that are accessible, meaning wheelchair accessibility, have access to electricity for medical equipment and refrigeration of medicines. You know, are school curriculums culturally competent to ensure disabled girls feel safe and included in school? I think also looking at the ways gender-based violence impact women and girls globally and here at home. I read UN Women shared that the impact of COVID around the world, up to 10 million girls are at risk of child marriage. 10 million more girls are at risk of child marriage over the next decade. 200 million women and girls aged 15 to 49 have undergone female genital mutilation. and 1 in 4 girls have gone through female genital mutilation in certain parts of Africa. And then you have bullying in schools, and then even in the United States, the rates of gender-based violence against Black women and girls is very alarming. In 2020, the FBI reported that 4 Black women and girls were murdered every day in the United States. And of the 260,000 women and girls missing, 100,000 are Black women and girls. So when you're looking at issues that don't seem to be directly connected to education, they are very much connected to education, because violence and excluding certain types or certain identities from classrooms prevent girls from accessing their right to education and quality education. And then there are other issues like period poverty, just other issues that we need to look at from an intersectional perspective, I think, that I'd like to see more of.
Well, UNESCO has a full agenda. And we're looking forward to be able to see some of those things, those areas improve. I have, I think, one other last question before I start moving to some of our public questions. So as local advocates, how can communities support global girls' education? So meaning, in what ways do local efforts influence national and global policy, vice versa? So how can we support, basically, how can we support the work of UNESCO? Maybe Jim, I can let you pick that up.
Yeah, I'll start out, and then London can say what I missed. A broader perspective. I mean, of course, I think a lot of it is becoming educated, learning about UNESCO. People who just learning more about its mission, its programs, and such is one step. And also learning, discerning what's kind of true, discerning fact from non-fact in relation to UNESCO, I think is important. Emphasizing again the connections with communities and the interests of communities. School, of course, providing opportunities to think about issues through the work and lens of UNESCO, influencing policymakers or legislators, writing them letters, calling them up, that kind of thing. And just day to day, at the grocery store, bringing up UNESCO. You can't really just say, well, someone in line, well, I just went to a great UNESCO event. But, with your friends,
But you kind of can. You can.
I
We
would
don't
totally
mind.
do that.
But with people, the popular opinion plays a really important role, and very quiet. It's hard to discern directly, but sort of just generally raising the level of awareness and the benefits. So
Yeah, I think that's a great, those are great ways to support girls' education globally. And in addition to learning about UNESCO, talking about UNESCO, I think also becoming more aware of the US's global policies on education. One way we can learn more about how the US is interacting globally is to visit the State Department's Office of Global Women's Issues. And it's also known as SGWE, and that's where you'll learn a lot about how the United States is addressing gender inequality issues globally. I think in addition to incorporating conversations about UNESCO, supporting women-led, BIPOC-led organizations that support girls' education globally, centering intersectionality in all of our conversations, and then again, incorporating programs of UNESCO locally, adopting the principles of the International Decade for People of African Descent, Cities for CEDAW, and other international policies, adopting them and recognizing them locally as a way to support.
Two additional quick thoughts based on London's comments. One is to support UNA. Support the work of UNA. It's organized. It has an important voice in DC and around the country, and so supporting UNA is a good way to work on UNESCO, and also connecting local issues. I mean, we've talked about this around this, but connecting local issues with the global work of UNESCO. If we're talking about anti-racism education or anti-Semitism, Holocaust education and such, UNESCO has work in all of those areas as well as girls' education. So that's what I think.
Thank you both. I have some questions coming from the chat, and it's 9:42 now, so I'm going to read, but I'll share the first question, and if you would please, whoever feels most inclined to respond, please feel free to respond. So our first question, they ask, can you please address the importance of teacher shortages, getting to the core of quality public education? UNESCO teams with ILO on this issue through CART, and the UN Secretary General just focused a high-level panel on this.
Sure. It may be that the questioner knows more about this than I do, for sure. But I think I mean, teachers are obviously the one essential component of education, of course, students. And shortages are an issue around the world in different subject matter areas and also in terms of representation of women in teaching. In some places, women outnumber men as teachers, but often that changes with higher levels of education and in leadership roles. So focusing on shortages, it's a complex issue because teachers vie with military for the largest set government employees in most of the world. And so a small raise in salary has tremendous budget implications and such. But working to elevate the importance of education, of girls' education, but of education in general, so that teachers can be hired, paid a living wage, so they don't have to teach, don't have to work after school to supplement their income, and prepare them for it's obviously a critical component. And there are initiatives, as the questioner points out, underway to deal with those, and hopefully they'll be successful.
Thank you, Jim. Another question is, how does, and maybe London, you kind of touched on this a little bit earlier, how does UNESCO intersect with UN Women and other gender-focused UN initiatives?
That is a good question. I think that sharing of information, that gathering of information, both UNESCO and UN Women are they are resources for us as civil society to use in our advocacy to promote gender equality and those intersectional issues, to promote the funding and support of the UN in general. So I think that that's how they intersect, by providing that information, providing talking points, and helping us to leverage locally information that we can use to advance what's happening locally and globally. So yeah, those are how they intersect. One of the ways they intersect.
The questioner raises the really critical, important issue of gender-based violence, and gender-based violence. I mean, in some places, 1 out of 3, 1 out of 2 girls and women experience gender-based violence in relation to school. Schools can be very dangerous places for girls, en route to school or even at school in terms of relationships with fellow students, with teachers and such. And so some of this is a poverty issues. A lot of it, of course, is power and managing that. And so, yes, gender-based violence is an enormous obstacle to achieving the possibilities for women's education. And of course, it contributes to a general lawlessness in society and more than disrespect, but for women and their role.
Those are all very good points. Thank you, Jim. This next question is probably a little bit on the heels of what you just answered, London. But the question is, how does UNESCO work in concert with other UN agencies, such as UNICEF and UN Women on girls' education? So I guess really kind of the broader question is, we have a number of perhaps agencies who have intersecting interests and policies, and are you seeing them working in concert?
Jim, would you?
Oh, sure. Am I muted? No, good. Have to be careful about that. Of course, UNESCO works with different agencies, coordinates. I mean, there's a lot of coordination in the field of particular programs, as in some sense they occupy different niches within the system. It's not really a system, but within the ecosystem, perhaps. UNESCO's less of a programming agency than a guidance, convening, documenting, inspiring, advocating kind of agency. And so it's whereas UNICEF is much more program-based and does a lot of work in the field, and it funds projects more directly. It's better funded, and its purpose is much more operational, close to the ground. And so there's a natural complementarity in a sense between those. UN Women similarly is involved in programs. And so ideally, of course, there's a great deal of coordination among the different agencies. And in many cases, there is in the field. And at headquarters, there's communication across different agencies, the ILO initiative that was being discussed and such.
Thank you, Jim.
And
I
I'm
have,
sorry, and of course, each agency does have it. Each agency does have its own agenda, and those are not necessarily smoothly working together. But that's part of the work of organizations, is to coordinate and to hammer out different agendas and move the work forward.
thank you, Jim. So this next question, actually, I'm very curious. Does UNESCO work with the G20 or G7, W20 and W7?
Good question.
Yeah.
Please, London.
I am not sure.
Mm.
That would have to be something I could provide information about later.
Okay, so
Yeah,
we'll have to take notes and do a little study and get back to you on that one.
Oh.
I think as of right now, that was the last of our questions in the chat. If you do have any other additional questions for our speakers, please feel free. We do have like a few more minutes, I see. If you'd like to present those questions, you can do so now. So, I mean, this kind of leads us to kind of, wrap things up here, Jim and London. We're at this brink of being able to see the US come back to the table. There's been this vacuum for so long. President Biden has earmarked, 150 million for fiscal year 2024, trying to get us back, to address our arrears. And, quite frankly, UNESCO, really, it wasn't really permissible for countries to just drop out and then come back in and then assume to have business as usual. So, we can expect, I would think, the US kind of hoping to be able to assume that position, but quite frankly, China is now covering a large percentage of the budget for UNESCO, and the playing field has changed a little bit. So, what are you seeing with that in terms of our topic today? How have we been seeing some of these programs that may have had some shortages because of US funding? Are we seeing some of these programs kind of filter to Chinese more perspectives and agenda, or are we seeing something still across the board where UNESCO is kind of at the forefront driving some of that policy and the agenda? If that makes any sense. Are we seeing a shift in terms of who's behind the wheel and how UNESCO is operating based on that?
Good question. I mean, of course, UNESCO is always, this is one of the US's objections, I think, underlying, is that UNESCO always negotiates among member states for policy agendas or for agendas going forward. And unlike, say, the World Bank, where voting depends on the amount contributed, in UNESCO, it's much more one country, one vote in many ways. Of course, money has its influence. I think the US is, I don't know, I'm certainly China is pushing some initiatives. And if the US isn't there to talk about it, then that doesn't, the US voice doesn't get in there. I think the inconsistency of US support and the questions about it weaken our ability to influence long run, because who knows, in 4 years, 8 years, we may be out again. And so the consistency of, for example, the Chinese is I think works to their advantage if we're thinking in those terms. But it also works to consistency, works to the advantage of UNESCO and its planning and its programs. And so if they're, so anyway, that's what I think.
I think that's the reason why it is crucial that those of us living in the United States follow closely the activities of UNESCO and US engagement as a member state of UNESCO, and to, in our advocacy, ensuring that UNESCO is a regular talking point so that we ensure our policymakers know how important this is to us. And so it really will require us as advocates to remain educated and vocal about our support for UNESCO.
Yeah, I think that not supporting UNESCO means losing opportunities. And one can rejoin particularly because of our resources that we contribute to the organization and have a role, but it is, and it's not shooting ourselves in the foot, but it's not taking advantage of opportunities we have to work. And ultimately, it's more costly. Well, it is costly to our reputation, to our voice internationally.
I cannot thank you both enough for being able to share your expertise and your knowledge and your background and also your passions. It's been a delight. We're near the end of our hour. If there's anything else that you just wanted to add before we cut off here.
Well, please go ahead if you like, London. I'm sorry, I don't mean to jump in unduly.
No, go ahead.
Just to say, as the latest question points out, UNESCO does a lot of things. It works with journalists, as pointed out. It tries to ensure access of everyone in terms of journalism, in terms of ideas. It tries to promote a I'm not putting this very well, but it does a lot of work to support journalists, to support those who are under attack, to speak up for freedom of speech and such. It does work in science in terms of support, and it works intersectionally, as London's pointed out, in terms of, say, women scientists, women in STEM, and health in terms of gender-based violence and such. So there's so many areas that UNESCO is working, and it's difficult to summarize them all. I imagine it's hard for the agency to keep track of all the things that it's doing. Yeah.
Thank you, Jen. London, you wanted to say something, or?
I am just very, very excited to be here today. I'm very excited to talk about UNESCO and what we can do as the United States with working with UNESCO. And I'm looking forward to, sharing more locally in my community about UNESCO. I'm really looking forward to having those discussions long-term about the support of UNESCO.
Thank you. And thank you so much to all of our listeners who joined us today for this discussion. There is contact information for both Dr. Williams and for Ms. Bell if you would like to reach out to them directly for any follow-up questions or discussion. There are also some resources for today's events that have been posted in our chat that you're welcome to click on those links before you go. Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. We appreciate what you've shared with us today and to help us stay globally aware and responsible.
Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.